had it rough. We didn't get Super Mario RPG, we didn't get Chrono Trigger, we didn't get Final Fantasy VI. We basically didn't get RPGs, and I'd say until the last decade, we got everything later than the rest of the world too. I was 13 when Super Smash Bros. Brawl came out, and as someone who followed every dojo post and basically worshipped that game every day, I could not wait 3 extra months for it to come to the UK. I got myself a freeloader disc and asked my parents to import the game for my birthday. But all that stuff is in the past now. We can play those RPGs on other platforms, and who cares how long a game took to come out when we can play it right now? Well, there's one thing that Europe is forever cursed with. Hey everybody, how do you do? Allow me to tell you about the EU. The United Kingdom may not be there anymore, but there's some history we can't ignore. A chunk of the world is split into 3 things. There's PAL, there's CCAN, there's NTSC. Here in Europe, everything is PAL. When you go back, you'll wonder how. So if you're an American, have a splash. Everything in these drawers is trash. Garbage. 50Hz games. Up until around the 2000s, and even in the 2000s for some games, almost every single release in Europe ran around 20% slower than its American counterpart. If I put the PAL Ocarina of Time head to head with the NTSC version, watch how quickly they fall out of sync. But if I were to just increase the PAL speed by around 20%, perfect match. And it's not just that the game speed is slower, the actual frame rate is lower. I'm not going to get too technical, but basically the world has different electricity standards. European countries, starting with Germany, went with 50Hz of electricity as that's what they needed to power their houses. America though went higher at 60Hz to reduce flicker. And Japan was kind of both. Some parts of the country were 50Hz and the other was 60Hz, but appliances were still typically developed with 60Hz in mind. So the world was in a divide. All appliances in Europe and Australia were powered by 50Hz of electricity, whereas in America and most of Japan, everything is 60Hz. Nowadays, European TVs can accept a 60Hz signal just fine, but in the 20th century, every TV was 50Hz. But I mean, this is still kind of an issue. Hell, because I bought my camera in the UK, it can only capture at 25 frames per second or 50 FPS, whereas the exact same camera bought in America could do 30 FPS or 60 FPS. So when it comes to film, those standards are still there today. Not much of a biggie though. I mean, movies are shot at 24 FPS, and to run that on a 50Hz display has no real loss in frames. If anything, that's more efficient than 60Hz. But here's the problemo. The majority of games were developed in the US and Japan, both of which using 60Hz as a standard. And when these games were eventually localized for European territories, they were very rarely optimized for 50Hz. Everything just runs 20% slower. And at the time, this was just the way it was, we didn't know any better. But even then, there was a highly distinguishable flaw: the music. When I say everything ran slower, I mean everything ran slower. For the longest time, I thought Sonic's speed was nothing more than a marketing gimmick because he legitimately was not fast in Europe. Even the soundtrack had this mellow, easygoing tone to it. But PAL did have advantages. Games may run slower, but PAL had a much more vibrant color output, and was capable of displaying 625 vertical lines of resolution, opposed to NTSC's 525. So the colors can be better, and the resolution can be higher. So did games use this? Nah, instead every game's aspect ratio was squished and had these big chunky coloured borders. There are technically points in PAL's favour, but games generally just didn't showcase them. But as time went on, developers would start to realise, hey, this sucks! And slowly, games were somewhat optimised in Europe. Now Sonic 2 still runs slower than the American version, but listen to the music. That's more like it. Sega would even fix up Sonic 1's audio in the Sega Saturn Sonic Jam, though again, the game itself still runs at 50Hz. Rare, however, were a great exception to the industry. Being a British studio, they highly optimized their games in Europe, with the vast majority of their conversions being at full speed. Not just the music either. The PAL versions of Donkey Kong Country, Banjo-Kazooie, GoldenEye, Killer Instinct, they all run flawlessly without compromise. I'm not sure if they needed to adjust the actual game speed to achieve this, but these are PAL versions you can play today without feeling like you're getting a lesser experience. But one of the first studios to truly bring European standards forward was Sega. The Dreamcast was my first home console growing up, and I remember booting up Sonic Adventure and being greeted with these numbers. I had no clue what they meant and just went for the bigger one. Good decision, little John. Many TVs by this point were fully capable of displaying 60Hz. And a huge chunk of Dreamcast games gave you the option of a slower 50Hz version and a full-speed 60Hz version. Everyone could play, and you could get the better experience. In terms of visuals, the Dreamcast was already a massive leap over other consoles of its time, especially in performance with a lot of games running at 60 FPS, but this really sealed the deal. This was the future of the industry. Why are so many PlayStation 2 games 50Hz? Yeah, Devil May Cry, the PS2's pioneer high-speed action game, ran 20% slower in Europe, even after the Dreamcast tried to set a worldwide standard. GameCube, on the other hand, was a lot more consistent. Basically, all first-party games would output at full speed, and you'd often get the option of 50 or 60, much like Dreamcast. Though some games needed button combinations while booting up to force them into a 60Hz mode. The same's true for some PS2 games. American systems would use this to force 480p video, but we just used it to force an acceptable playing experience. Now here's a fun thing, re-releases. We've already covered that Sonic Jam fixed Sonic 1's audio, so surely future compilations will do the exact same thing and maybe even fix the video as well? Yeah, the Sonic Mega Collection actually did. The GameCube was the very first time that Europeans could play Sonic 1 at full speed, both the audio and the video. It was bliss. Why the f does Sonic Mega Collection Plus run at 50Hz? Are you telling me the Plus is a lie? Yeah, even in the 2000s, standards were all over the place. Xbox and GameCube have generally aged very well, but there's still a massive chunk of games from that era that don't run at full speed. Look at this list of PS2 games with the 60Hz mode. There are so many no's! Crazy Taxi runs at 50Hz on PS2, but 60Hz on Dreamcast. How did they mess that up? Even Harry Potter Quidditch World Cup is compromised? They've gone too far. Exclusive and first-party games are all over the place too. Both Metal Gear games run at 50Hz, both Persona games run at 50, and weirdly Ratchet & Clank 1 runs at 60, but all the sequels are 50. Why? Then we've got the Wii. Oh boy. So as a whole, almost every Wii game runs at 60Hz. You would choose between 50 and 60 in the Wii menu rather than it being software specific. So why is Sonic the Hedgehog 50Hz again? For whatever reason, companies thought people were nostalgic for their compromised versions of legacy games, and so both the Wii Virtual Console and PlayStation 1 Classics consisted entirely of PAL versions. Did you want to play Zelda 1 like this? Well, you had no choice. And Wii U Virtual Console would begin doing the exact same thing until people were loud enough for them to eventually realize they were the devil. Then they just gave us the American versions. And yet, despite so many games I grew up with being lesser versions of ones released elsewhere, I was still infatuated with so many of them. I actually wasn't much of a Nintendo kid until my teens, but I was so jealous of my friend who had a GameCube and Wind Waker. Like everyone else on Earth, I got caught up in the hype for the Wii, and this thing was my portal to all things Nintendo. I remember being so excited for the Wii and Twilight Princess that I actually got a cheap N64 and Ocarina of Time from a used game store in around 2005. And this was technically my first Nintendo home console. And that was the only game I had, Ocarina of Time. So I went from Ocarina of Time to Twilight Princess to the Wii Virtual Console. And this let me experience the NES, the Super Nintendo, more of the N64, and the GameCube all at once. And at the time, ignorance was bliss. Despite being 50Hz, these were still outstanding games. I even remember enjoying Zelda 1 more than Twilight Princess at the time. Playing Mario 64 for the very first time was a magical experience, even if it ran at 25 FPS rather than 30. And likewise, Ocarina of Time doesn't run at a great frame rate in NTSC, and is much worse in PAL. It's basically consistently 18 FPS, which isn't great, but I still loved it. Though, we also got screwed on the cartridge. A golden one was released in Australia, which is also 50Hz, but everywhere else in Europe got this boring old grey one. We eventually got a gold cartridge for Majora's Mask, but then you guys got this holographic one! I grew up into this industry, and I still play 50Hz games from time to time, but today I would of course much rather go for 60Hz versions. I own multiple console variants for this very reason, and oftentimes I have to import games from America or Japan. In some cases, if an NTSC console is modified to accept PAL cartridges, they'll play back at full speed. But if a game is actually optimized for PAL, this can have weird repercussions with the game being much faster than it's meant to be. I was a huge handheld gamer growing up, and I suppose that was kind of a sacred realm. A Game Boy is a Game Boy no matter where you're from, so if you wanted the full-speed Mario experience, you can get that in Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. I mean, you lose like 60% of the screen, but it's something. The NES Super Mario Bros. Is actually a really weird one. It's one of the earliest games optimized for PAL, but instead of making the music the same speed as NTSC, they for whatever reason made it faster. They optimized it too much, I guess, and now it sounds like you're always low on time. And for some reason you can hit these blocks in PAL, but you can't in NTSC. Always found that weird. It's not like PAL games are cheaper to collect either. Games like Symphony of the Night are so much more expensive. I ended up buying an American PS2 primarily just to own this game. It was cheaper to import a PS2 and a copy of the game from America than it was just to get the PAL version. This also helped out with some American exclusives like Xenosaga. Why did Europe get Episode 2 but not Episode 1? Or 3? But, mwahaha, in 2018 Americans got a taste of PAL games with the PlayStation Classic. And for whatever godforsaken reason, this used PAL ROMs for a large chunk of the games in its worldwide release. This includes fighting games like Tekken 3. People did not accept this, and it's a large reason the console didn't sell. We've more or less hit a point where English versions of a game not only release the same day worldwide, but they also run at the same speed now. It sucks that a large part of my collection is doomed to always be slightly compromised, but I still love owning these things. And honestly, as long as the audio isn't unnaturally slow and the game is still fun, adapting to a slower speed is just something you get used to over time. And in some, but very few cases, the limitations are actually a good thing. Mario 64 could have quite bad frame drops in the NTSC version, whereas the longer release schedule for the PAL release gave them more time to fix this line of code. It's still all around a slower game, but it's a more consistent one. I don't really feel like I had a lesser childhood because of these games, and I didn't even know there was a difference until much later in my life. It's evident once you know, but good games will always be good games. Ocarina of Time and Shadow of the Colossus both run pretty poorly at 60Hz, and they're still heralded as classics. There are updated versions today that make things a lot more stable, yet somehow I still preferred the original. Maybe that's just Stockholm Syndrome. But yeah, 50Hz sucks, and if I can, I will avoid it, but good games? They're always going to be good games, even if they're 20% slower.